What's up, man?
Hi, Dr. Helms. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Daniel. How about you?
Very well. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
How are things going there with the COVID situation that's never ending, apparently?
I would say mostly good. So I don't want to sound like I'm complaining, but um, we have no COVID in the community in New Zealand, which is amazing, which is great. But the downside is that the vaccine rollout is relatively slow, so we can't travel.
Right. Makes sense.
Um, don't get me wrong, I really appreciate that the government is rolling out vaccines at the speed they can and that they have such good border control, as it's kept us all safe. But being one of the smaller developed nations here in New Zealand, it does mean that we have COVID under control. We're kind of on the bottom of the list as far as like getting enough vaccines and spreading it out rapidly. So I probably will not be leaving the small islands until maybe next year. So
Sometimes you're still training at home, right?
yes, yeah, I'm very
Very well.
fortunate that I got a home gym. Although gyms are open, so I could if I wanted to.
Very well. So it's great to see you again. Great to talk about this topic this time. And the topic at hand, precisely volume and progression for hypertrophy training. Maybe I'm joining the party a little bit late because of this volume wars that occurred a couple of years back.
Oh, this party has been going on since the '70s, bro. Like it's a nonstop rave. Here we got Arnold throwing down. We got folks like the Hit Crew throwing down, Arthur Jones. We got the Brits throwing their little piece in the mix, and then of course you've got the research that's going back and forth. But yeah, relatively
Yeah,
contentious
those
topic.
those heavy duty, those Mike Menser videos were actually quite fun to watch. Those for
Absolutely.
those programs were sour days after days.
Yeah, and then the
But
Dorian
anyway,
follow-ups. Just love getting.
all
I
right.
love hearing Diesel being yelled in a British accent. It just makes me so happy. So
So anyway, let's begin, if you will. Volume and hypertrophy. We can say a lot of things about volume. Maybe we need less, maybe we need more. Maybe some people would say you need a lot. Maybe some people would say that's not true. So anyway, how can we best begin to understand what's the relationship between volume? What is volume? What is actual volume? And the relationship between this and hypertrophy? Because our conception of volume has been changing. Volume load, which is a little bit random, apparently. Hard sets, repetitions, because a while back I remember the first edition of the Science and Development for Muscle Hypertrophy by Dr. Schoenfeld. The first version actually said volume in regards to repetitions, but now it's volume in regards to hard sets. So how can
hmm
we understand all these topics better?
good question. Yeah, I think probably starting with the actual metric that we track it would be useful because then people will know what we're talking about when we say volume, right? So not only was Dr. Schoenfeld's book written about repetitions, the first edition of my Muscle and Strength Pyramids that I wrote in late 2015, where I also gave volume recommendations and
All right.
repetitions. And that's and some might be confused. At the time, people were a little confused by that because the way that most people tracked volume up until right around that point was volume load. And for those who don't know, volume load or quote unquote tonnage is sets times reps times load. So you get this number of pounds or kilos that you've lifted, right? And we'll get into the benefits and pros and cons of each, but that was the way that most people tracked the volume. However, if we wanted to give an evidence-based recommendation for how much volume you should do, or if we wanted to make a statement about the relationship between volume, hypertrophy, and strength, at the time, circa 2015, when I was writing these books, and when I made the videos prior to them in 2013, and when Brad Schoenfeld wrote his books, the closest thing we had to like a meta-analytic an analysis of this was a paper by Wernbaum, which was like a pseudo meta-analysis assessment. And what they did was they looked at the total number of repetitions and they associated them with rates of change in hypertrophy as basically like a percentage gain per week. And there was this cluster of data that suggested right around like 40 to 70 reps per muscle group per week would get you in the right zone. And I think that's useful when you're looking at the literature, because the literature, 90% of the data is in training to failure. And that's a useful way in science to control for effort. Like if you go to failure, that's all that really matters, because there's issues with using percentage of 1RM. If I have you do 8 reps at 70% and I do 8 reps at 70%, that might be, I could only do 10 reps and maybe you could do 20. So there'd be very different proximities to failure. But if we both do our 8RM, it's an 8RM, right? So anyway, while that was relatively useful, I think in the science, I don't think it was good from a recommendation standpoint, because data came out that would suggest that 3x15 to failure and 3x6 to failure would both produce similar hypertrophy.
Right.
So the problem there is if you do the tonnage calculation, you're getting 100% more volume with the 3x15, but it doesn't represent anything. Like those sets of 15 with 65% of 1RM versus those sets of 6 with 85% of 1RM, they're producing the same stimulus. And what we've seen over the years of research is that ultimately, from a hypertrophy perspective, which is an important thing to consider here, that if there is matched effort, 2 different loads within a reasonable rep range that's not too short are going to produce a similar stimulus, because you eventually get to the same place of motor unit recruitment, either from it being heavy enough and just requiring it to produce the force initially, or if it's light and there's cumulative fatigue, which results in subsequent motor unit recruitment as that fatigue accumulates, and you have to recruit those high threshold fibers anyway. So that was a long rant, but the point is that where we were at that time, if you wanted to make an evidence-based recommendation and actually have it be based on evidence that you cited, not just something logical, it was Warnbaum and it was nothing else.
It was quite confusing, sorry to interrupt, with the whole repetition thing. To establish some repetitions, how do you establish per exercise, per session? It was quite confusing. I'm sorry, that was all my, that's all I had to say, that it was confusing.
Absolutely. And I would say it was only slightly less confusing than tonnage, because like, how do you give recommendations on tonnage? You basically can't, right? So just as to briefly give an aside so someone understands why tonnage is potentially not useful from like a content production standpoint. If I wanted to tell people what's the appropriate tonnage, I really just can't. Like, for example, if you're a 5'2", extremely strong woman, you might have a deadlift max of 315. But if you're a 6-foot guy who's been lifting for a year and you have decent genetics and you've been doing it right, you might be pulling 405. So do I tell a highly advanced lifter that and a relatively intermediate, late stage novice male that they need the same tonnage, totally, even though, like, it doesn't make any sense, because it's sets times reps times load. So your strength can really skew things. Likewise, same problem with the the rep comparison thing. 3x15 is 45 reps, 3x6 is 18 reps. It's more than 2 times the number of reps, but same hypertrophy. That multiplier goes into the sets times reps times load. So tonnage is really only useful within an individual within the same movement, from a utility perspective. Reps is useful in the literature if we're comparing a relatively tight zone of repetitions, all to the same effort, which is what we had in the literature, which is why we saw those relationships. And it wasn't until I want to say Nathan Jones wrote this article for Stronger by Science.
I know. Sure.
Yep. And it was I think it's called like the new way of tracking volume. And it was a year or 2 years before an article, or I should say a meta-analysis came out that supported this. But he basically said, hey, if a set of 6 and if a set of 15 get you to the same point from a hypertrophy perspective, if they're matched effort, then why don't we just count sets so long as they're sufficiently high number of reps? We're talking like 5 or 6 reps. And it made a lot of sense. And I was like, I really like this idea. I hope we get some empirical data to back it. And then not but 2 years later did Schoenfeld produce the meta-analysis that everyone is quite familiar with, where they look at the relationship between 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus sets with hypertrophy. And they found increasing effect sizes as you did more sets. Not linear, and it does probably diminish. We don't have data plus the 10 plus, or we didn't at that time. But essentially, it established that, yeah, when you just track sets, it does fit. That model fits the relationships that we see in the literature, and it seems to explain the discrepancies in different repetition ranges. Then there was a systematic review by Enrico Basvalle, that came out, I want to say 2019, and kind of confirmed this again. He specifically was comparing matched number of sets and the different rep ranges, and said, the vast majority of the research suggests you can just specifically look at number of quote unquote hard sets, as long as they're at
Right.
least 6 reps or higher. So now we've got meta-analyses that show this beneficial effect of tracking number of sets. We've got a systematic review that confirms it and then narrows it down a bit, kind of gauging the rep ranges. And that was fantastic. This was now 2019. And that's when I went, this alone is enough to spur me to write the second edition of my books, because I want to not have confusing recommendations, because I didn't like recommending based on reps either. But there's no other really good way to do it. So yeah, that was the primary motivation I actually had to be like, what, let's start writing the second edition. This is really useful. I think it's one of those times where it's a heuristic that really helps people. There's a great saying by the statistician, I want to say George Box, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So number of hard sets absolutely doesn't encapsulate everything we need to know about hypertrophy, but it
Right.
encapsulates enough for us to give useful recommendations for volume. And that's where we are. So that's probably
also
step one, is just knowing what the hell we're talking about.
totally, and also evidence-based recommendations, not just empirical. I
Yeah.
just think the one little issue with counting hard sets, it's, for example, in a bench press, do we count it solely for the pecs? In a squat, do we count it solely for the quads? That's maybe a little bit confusing, but how can we best measure this? How can we do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this again comes down to the same decision I made to give recommendations based on reps, is because we had in the literature, is the same reason why I, in my book, say, look, this is sets for whether they are bench press or tricep pushdowns, you count them for triceps. And people go, but surely tricep pushdowns give more of a stimulus for bench press. And I go, yeah, I know they do. Of course they do. However, what is the data based on? The meta-analysis by Schoenfeld? It's counting it all the same. So we can't call ourselves evidence-based based on the literature if we go, well, I think bench should count half those sets towards triceps. And it's like, well, all right, that might be true, but 10 plus sets is based on counting it 1-to-1. So all of a sudden now, if you want to count your number of sets differentially for how much they contribute to a given movement, now you don't have a benchmark to use in the literature. So now you have to use some common sense. And this is where you have to blend the art and the science. The science says, look, we don't have that much granularity. We don't have that much detail. All we know is that when you train the biceps, the quads, the triceps, and the pecs, whether it's directly or indirectly, we have this 10 plus sets kind of recommendation as a decent place to start from. However, the art is, okay, you're a bodybuilder, you're an intermediate, you're starting to notice that you actually have weak points and strong points. You want to bring up your triceps. You don't go, I'm a robot. All presses and pushdowns are the same for improving my triceps. No, you go, right, I'm going to add some direct tricep work, right? So that's where logic comes in. But what I
Right.
don't think is a good idea, and I do disagree with people who do this, is they start giving recommendations on, hey, you need to count your sets as half a set for this, half a set for this. Oh, and by the way, here's my recommendations for number of sets. They're based on the meta-analysis, because those conflict. You
Right.
can't blend those two things. I logically agree that those exercises bias certain muscle groups, but this data is not based on that, if that makes sense.
And also becomes quite a mess to count, I don't know, half the sets you did for bench press for your triceps. Like, it becomes a blur, and you don't know later on how many sets you were actually doing. So in terms of also the practice of it, I think it's also to stay true to those recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
So now
I
we
just saw this out of the corner of my eye. I'm sorry. Renato, he asked, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. What a great phrase. Can I quote you on that one? Don't quote me. I was quoting someone else. That's a statistician. His name is George Box. Sorry, go ahead.
Hey man, you can take that quote. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure he wouldn't mind.
I'll just give an
But
MLK speech and claim it was mine
yeah,
too.
there you go. Okay, so now we actually know what we're talking about when we say volume and all
Mm-hmm.
these different conceptions of volume. But volume itself, now we have a number also, 10 plus sets, but that is per week. I think also we have this, I think it's a meta regression by James Krieger that told us that we have also a threshold in a
Mm-hmm.
session, about 6 to 8 sets, if I'm not mistaken. But we need to take into account rest periods.
Yeah. there's a lot of things we have to take into account, actually, I think, within. So yeah, for those who are not familiar, James Krieger, part of that original meta-analysis, he has done a lot of metas and is very good statistically in our field. He also has some in-house meta regressions and meta-analyses he does for weightology, which is a research review that he's had for a long time. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. And he works with a bunch of other people, Cody Hahn, Brandon Roberts, some really great researchers in the field. Anywho, so he has some in-house meta-regressions and meta-analyses, and he puts forth that, it seems like, and this is very logical when you think about it, there is a point of diminishing returns of volume within session. And this of course makes sense. If I told you you need to do 20 sets of quadriceps per week to optimally grow, that's not everyone. That's just say a person. And you were like, sweet, I'll do that all in the same session. You'd be like, oh, slow down. Like that's not a good idea.
Right.
The quality of those sets is going to get progressively worse. And depending on your exercise selection and the rest periods, like you were talking about, the reason why you'd be achieving a quote unquote high effort might be for more global cardiometabolic, cardiorespiratory reasons, rather than achieving that local muscular fatigue that would result in that high threshold motor units recruitment, which would make each one of those sets equivalent. So yeah, if you wanted to do, I think, 10 or 12 sets of biceps in the same session, I think that'd be less of an issue than if you tried to do it with quads and you're using traditional training techniques like hack squat, leg press, squats, where you'd just be so tired.
Good luck with that.
Right. Yeah. You'd take someone who could squat 405, and by the end of the session, they'd be having just one skillet on those squats because they'd be so jacked up. So it makes sense to probably spread it out. And this is a side tangent, and I won't spend too much on it because I know you want to talk about volume. But the latest meta-analyses on frequency seem to actually give some indirect support of this. So literally just 2017, 2018, the data was overall leaning towards higher frequency is neutral to positive, maybe slightly better independently of volume. Now we have meta-analyses on both strength and hypertrophy that have come out, Schoenfeld being a part of them, Gurgic, Marshall, and Ralston, that all suggest that, hey, actually the effect of higher frequency is actually a volume effect. So when you look at volume equated studies, frequency doesn't seem to be independently beneficial. Rather, it's the unequated volumes. So the idea here is that if you're going to do high volumes, you probably need to split it up into multiple sessions. So if you're someone who responds better to a higher volume approach, it kind of takes like a 1 times per week frequency off the table, or you run into that situation we're talking about where you're trying to do 20 sets in a single session.
So all that we have until this point, it's more volume is better, but maybe we can do better if we distribute it with higher frequencies. But up until a point, maybe we can start with 10 plus sets between 2 sessions. If you want to go beyond that, maybe we can use 3 sessions, 4 sessions, but not to the point of no return. Let's say it's not that direct relationship between more equals more gains, because that's when we enter the point of, like I said, no return. Something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you used a really important word in that. You used the word start. So the guidelines and the evidence are largely based, not completely, but largely based on recreationally trained and primarily untrained individuals. We are getting more trained research, and they are based upon population averages. So a meta-analysis is we take a bunch of these 10 to 30 subject studies, look at their means and their effect sizes and collate it together, weight it, rank them, and we get this aggregate population-based outcome of what is the relationship between volume. And like you said, it's not about how do we change it. It's just about the weekly average volume in these studies. So it's a very, very broad brushstroke. And how do we use that in evidence-based practice? That's the real question. And it's to set up maybe starting volume if you don't have good data on the individual. Like if I have an individual who comes to me and they've tracked their data well, they're relatively smart, they don't change a whole lot of variables at once, and we have good data to suggest, you're actually making quite good progress on 15 sets per week, I'm not going to go, well, let's wipe the slate clean and just go to 10. Like why would I do that? I have better, more specific individual data. So when do I use this evidence-based data? It's when someone comes to me and they don't have that high quality background, or if they're a relatively blank slate, or they're new, or they've been plateaued for a long time and they've been program hopping. Like, I don't know where to start you. Let's start with what's probably going to hit the largest bell curve of the population, because probability wise, you're probably going to sit somewhere in there. You might be 2 standard deviations out from the mean, but I'm not going to just randomly guess where that could be. I have to treat this from a probabilistic perspective. So we're going to start with, 10 sets distributed across 2 days per week. And that's a great place to start if you don't know what's best. And then you track your progress. You see which muscle groups develop, which ones don't, what movements move up, what ones don't. And then you add based on you and nothing else. You really don't even pay attention to literature anymore. So I think that that's a really important thing, is that, so it goes back to the question of, well, how do I count sets of triceps or biceps on compound movements? Well, what seems to be your sticking point in these movements? What develops when you do these compound movements? Do you have great arm development and you're just doing rows, pull downs, and presses? Maybe we don't need to add a whole lot of direct arm work. Or do you kind of have like the spider body where you've got good torso development but skinny arms? Okay, now we're going to add more volume via direct work. So I think that's the perspective you have to take, is you really have to know what to use the research for. And it is those broader brushstrokes. But the individual things like the progression, the rate of progression, what you progress with, which movements you add sets to, and how many sets you add or subtract is an important one as well. Because let's say we got this curve, right? We have what's called a semi-inverted U. And that's the basic perspective of, okay, if this is gains, right? And it is curved. It's not this linear relationship. It's not like 5 sets is 5 times as good as 1 set. In fact, some of the data would suggest it's only 10 to 20% better. You can multiply your sets by 5 and you get slightly better returns. So it's this diminishing returns effect.
Totally.
Right? So if we know that at the population level, it starts to plateau around 10 plus, then we have to think about, all right, well, if you have your own curve somewhere along that, and it's probably going to share a lot of that, but it could be left shifted or it could be right shifted. So what if you come to me and you're someone who responds really well to lower volume, and you just went, right, I'm going to do 10 plus when you'd be better off doing 6? The statement of, there is a point of getting better from volume is incorrect for you. You would actually get better results if we reduced volume. And I think that's important for the individual to understand, is that there's a pretty broad range. The inverted, it's not really a U, it's kind of like a bowl. There's this period where you probably go from like 8 to maybe like 22 sets, and it might be the exact same as far as you can actually measure changes in hypertrophy, and that's on average, that's not everybody. However, there's a point where it actually was just far too much and you won't benefit from it. And then you also have to think like, all right, if I'm getting marginally better gains doing 15 sets versus 12, but I'm also doing another 25% of the volume spending that time in the gym, is that worth it? Am I risking injury? I'm not trying to be like scare tactics or anything like that. Does it take away from the time I have to invest in the rest of my life? And that's causing the increased stress. Maybe I have to work out at a time I don't really want to, and I'm taking my pre-workout at 4 p.m. I don't have time to train my lunch break with 15 sets. I have to do it in the evening, and now I'm taking caffeine at 4, and then I can't follow, my sleep architecture's messed up and I can't sleep well at 10 p.m. Was that worth it? The answer might be no. So I think you do have to have a holistic perspective and think about, especially in more intermediate lifters or later, I often think of what's the least amount of volume I need to use to see measurable progress. And I think the hypothetical argument that you want to do as much as you can and get as most progress as you can is really short-sighted, in that most advanced lifters or high-level intermediates, any progress is awesome because most of the time they spent semi-plateaued, right? And if I have a high-level power lifter, weightlifter, or bodybuilder, injuries for them are much more costly. Like if Bryce Lewis gets hurt, he's potentially missing out on placing top 3 at USAPL Nationals or Worlds. Is that, and if he's at the top of the game, would I rather just increase his total by 7.5 and feel like I'm doing the least amount of risk to get there? Or would I want to be like, let's see if we can get 20 kilos on his total? So I think those are things you have to think about. And there's valid arguments to be had on both sides of that. But it's not just simply what's the fastest rate of progress I can get, and I'm going to do that amount of volume, because sometimes it might end up being a situation of the tortoise versus the hare. Like you're 100 yards ahead, you run into a tree, and then the turtle keeps passing you, type of thing. So,
And to actually get 20 kilos on Bryce's total, it's quite the endeavor.
and we did it, by the way. I just point that out at nationals.
Yeah,
He totaled 927.
yeah. Congratulations on that, because to get stronger at that level, it's quite astonishing.
Yeah,
So
man.
in actual to progression, in strength training, seems quite simple. If you want to get stronger, well, you lift heavier weights. But if you want to get bigger, do you lift heavier weights? Do you do more sets? Do you do more reps? And that's when the dichotomy comes in, volume versus intensity, as if we're totally separate entities. And that's actually the next part of the talk I wanted to discuss. How can we best progress in hypertrophy training, and also the terminology? Because I know some people use overload and progressive overload as interchangeables. And as far as the Brian Minor paper in which you also contributed, there's a clear distinction. And with that distinction, we can also understand all the training process in a different light, as if progress is not something that we have to chase day after day. Maybe progress is something that also happens organically. So
Yeah.
can we start by there, the definitions of overload and progressive overload?
Yeah, first, I think intensity is a minefield in and of itself. You know, we're kind of dealing with concept even underneath that. The terminology I use these days, just because there are so many different takes on this, even within the scientific community, let alone in the
Right.
bodybuilding community, is load and effort, because
Right.
they are the least, or even if I want to get even more nuanced, proximity to failure and load. Because everyone would agree that 85% of 1RM is a heavy load, right? Um, but if I do a single at 85% of 1RM, it's high load, relatively low effort. The proximity to
Totally.
failure, depending on the person, would be 5 to 6 reps from failure, you know? So most people, if you're like, yeah, training 5 to 6 reps from failure, that's wussy training. But no one's going to look at a top tier power lifter loading up 85% of their 1RM and be like, wuss, what's this 700-pound squat? Get that
So,
trash out of here, you know?
well, some people on the internet actually do it. So, yeah,
It's
you
true.
know,
I agree. There are a lot of stupid people out there. So ego, you know.
I hope I'm
Um,
not those. Trying our best, man.
yeah. So anyway, I think it's important. So we have load and we have effort or proximity to failure. And then the concept of progressive overload, I think progressive is a description of what occurs, but not necessarily a directive for what you need to do. If
Right.
you provide a sufficient stimulus, you should see progressive overload. And I think that is probably the most useful way of understanding it. Because some people think that the actual act of, say, adding 2.5 kilos to the bar is what's stimulating that growth. But that kind of assumes that things are always happening over a weekly time scale, while our body doesn't actually count weeks. You know, some people really kind of take progressive overload and just hone in on the load part, which is the example I'm using. So I think if we think more holistically, what is making hypertrophy occur, if that's what we want to talk about, it is tension. So progressive tension overload is essentially the root cause of hypertrophy at the basic level. Volume is how much of that progressive tension overload there is. And the concept of, you know, volume versus intensity is this understanding that the more volume you do, the harder it is from a psychological perspective, and sometimes from a cardiometabolic fatigue and respiratory fatigue, like I talked about in those early examples perspective, to maintain high tension. Like as I was saying, if you did 20 sets of squats in the same session, the tension produced in those latter sets, because you're just globally fatigued, is going to be lower than the initial ones. Um, so anyway, that's just a minor tangent, but the idea is that there is some relationship, and this is true in all exercise, to where you do a sufficient amount of volume and it starts to take away from intensity. So you have to find that inflection point that allows the best of both worlds over time. So if you did a high volume program, but it had insufficient overload, insufficient progressive tension overload, if all of your RPEs were, let's say, less than 4, so we're leaving more than 7 reps in the tank all the
Right.
time, you would see far worse growth than if you did a single set to failure. Now, of course, that's a straw man comparison. You probably wouldn't choose to do. I wouldn't advise choosing either one of those. But that helps us understand that volume is not like the key driver of hypertrophy. It's an important variable. Don't get me wrong. But if the sufficient effort is not there, then we have a problem. The volume is not going to be effective. And the question now is, well, how close, what level of effort do we need? And I think a better question is, what level of effort do we need for the amount of volume that we need? And what is the optimal combination at any given point in time for a lifter? And as they change, because it won't always be the same answer. And that's a much more challenging question to answer, I would say.
It's not as simple as it seems that, hey, bro, just add more weight, more sets, more everything. It becomes quite confusing at some point.
So that's kind of volume versus intensity. To get to your question about progressive overload, I think there are a number of ways to let this kind of quote unquote happen. The traditional bodybuilding approach is one that is moderate volume, relatively low frequency, and high effort. That's what most people do. It might look like high volume when you look at the number of sets within a given session, but when you do a bro split, when you just train, say, chest and triceps on a given day, even if you do 3 sets, 3 different exercises on chest for 3 to 4 sets apiece, you're really only getting to 8 to 12, 8 to 15 sets. It's not, no one would call that high volume. It is high per session volume, and probably too high based on that Krieger in-house meta-regression that you cited. But most sets are taken to failure. And how does progression occur? Well, they have a target rep range. And if they exceed that rep range, they add weight to the bar, or they simply add reps. And if the reps get too high, again, exceeding that rep range, they might do something else. And because they're always training to failure, progression is built in. So failure training is kind of this foolproof method, which has worked really well for most bodybuilders for 60 years. That means that at the very least, it is sufficient to allow someone to get to a very high level, but it doesn't mean it's optimal. Like the whole concept of anecdotes. Anecdotes are still evidence. They're not high quality evidence because they can only tell you some things. The concept, success leaves clues, which is a saying that's often quoted in English, like sports circles. Like basically, we should emulate what champions do. The problem with that is that what champions do, all we can know, that hasn't prevented them from becoming champions. But we can't say that we know that for sure is what caused them to be champions, because we don't have a comparison. What if they'd done something else? Could they be even better? We can't know. So we know that what they're doing is sufficient, but it may not be optimal. So anyway, again, I'm doing a lot of tangents, but hopefully they help people follow my train of thought.
Oh, they do. Don't worry. Don't worry about that.
Okay, good. So the concept of progressive overload, we know that we could just train to failure and add load and add reps when we can. I'd say, if you like that, and if you like high effort, and you like the pump, and if you like to grind it out, and if you want your videos to look hardcore, great way to go. However, if you want to explore what might be optimal, probably based on that meta-regression from Krieger and our understanding of volume, and knowing that it's more difficult to keep making progress as you become more advanced, which we kind of hinted at with Bryce's total going up. Most people, not everyone, are going to get to a point where they need to do more volume than they can handle in a single session. And the data we have currently suggests that there's not necessarily a benefit to going to failure compared to going to reasonably close to failure. So is there a way we can game the system to get another 5-10% out of the stimulus? And it might be that doing, say, more challenging exercises like compound free weight movements, like a squat, for example, to something like, most of the time, 5 to 8 RPE, somewhere in there, and then taking less stressful movements that target a specific muscle group, like a lateral raise or a curl or a push down. You can take those with the last set that you're going to train that muscle group to failure, be able to therefore do more volume, because you're not inducing as much fatigue, and then maybe increase your frequency to something like 2 or 3 times per week per muscle group, so you can distribute it across the week. So it's not just about how do I work as hard as possible today. It's about how do I work as hard as possible over the next 4 mesocycles. And that's where I think the Some people have it like they've got the right passion, they've got the right attitude, and they're like, when I go to the gym, I make sure I try as hard as I possibly can in every set. That's great, but could you train tomorrow? No. Okay, could you train 2 days from now, the same muscle group? No. Could you train 4 days from now? And you get to a certain point where you realize that they're trading the total benefit for the acute benefit. It's just kind of like
Totally.
they're only looking 2 feet in front of them. So anyway, when you start to go short of failure, when you start to train to moderate RPEs on certain movements, it is now necessarily a little more complex. Well, how do I progress? You know, now you have to be able to get a good gauge of how close to failure am I? You need to be accurate at going, I think I could do 3 more, or I think I could do 2 more, I think I could do 4 more, because then you can tell when you're actually progressing. This is the whole concept behind velocity-based training, where we actually attach a velocity tracker on the bar. And if I can lift, so I can know I'm stronger because I squatted 200 kilos now, and in 6 weeks I squat 205. Or if I have a velocity tracker, I can know I'm stronger because I squatted 200 kilos today at 0.2 meters per second, but in 6 weeks I squatted it at 0.26 meters per second. Because now the same load, I'm moving it faster. So therefore I'm putting out more force. It's just physics. And since not everyone wants to spend $400 on a LPT, a linear position transducer, which tracks velocity, a better way to do it is just get very good at tracking your proximity to failure. And then you can do things like, oh, okay, so like Brian Miner's model of like double auto-regulated progression basically is, you know what, I'm going to do 3 sets with a load that puts me between 6 to 15 reps, and I'm going to make sure that each set is at least at 8 RPE. And then once I get up to 3 by 15 at the low end of that RPE, so the top of the rep range, low end of the RPE range, then I increase load and I start over again. And you can, that's great if that's a sufficient amount of volume. But the problem with that kind of double progression model is that if you need more than 3 sets to progress, you have to also have a method of deciding when you want to add sets. So the problem, quote unquote, with not just training to failure is that you actually have to think. You actually have to figure out when you need to progress. I know, what's an appropriate rate?
Before.
And this is kind of the funny thing. Like you get some people who are catering more towards the general population and just helping people make gains with the most simplistic approach, which I love, by the way. I think that's what everyone who's not a competitor probably should do. And they get annoyed at like a sports scientist for trying to figure out how to get high performance at the highest level when we're doing 2 fundamentally different things. Like I don't tell, like if someone in the gym walks up to me and goes, hey, what's the best way for me to make gains? And I go, well, do you have 3 hours to listen to my talk on velocity-based training and auto-regulation? No, I tell them like, train hard. Here's the basic setup, like try this. And I think it's great to use the most simple approach as possible. However, if you're trying to get like your first pro win in bodybuilding, or if you're trying to beat Ashton Rushka at USAPL Nationals, going like harder than last time is a fantastic way. Yeah, it's a fantastic way to not improve at that level. So I think, and I don't think people who are saying that are catering to that. I think it's people talking across each other. They have to understand who is the information for. What is the audience you're speaking to, and what level of depth do you need to get to? And I think a lot of people do get far too deep than they need to, and they need a more simple progression model. So yeah, that's what I try to do, is I try to meet people where they're at most of the time.
And I think one super interesting point is just to look at your training pyramid, how before progression, you actually put volume, you put intensity and frequency. Because if you take care of those will take care of progression. And that can helps us understand that, okay, in its roots, it's not that complicated. But as we progress, as we become better, as we have more ambitious goals, we need to start thinking about the minutia, programming better, writing every little detail, getting better at gauging how much we are making an effort in our training. But on its roots, I think it's quite simple to understand what are we looking for in the gym, what are our sessions for, right?
I really appreciate that you identified that. I think that's a nuanced thing that a lot of people don't get when they look at the training pyramid. They go like, progressive overload should be like the first thing after adherence. Like, what's wrong with you, Eric Helms? Like, missed that one. And that is the fundamental misunderstanding of how overload occurs. Like,
the meal frequency on the nutrition pyramid. It's there for a reason. But anyway, sorry to interrupt.
no, but you got it exactly right. It's that what is the overload portion of progressive overload? It's the combination of volume and intensity, and then of course there needs to be a frequency attached to that that's appropriate for that volume and intensity. So if you get volume and intensity right, you've got overload right. And it is then, just like you said, only when you have more advanced level goals where you start having to think about, well, all right, well, how do I want to distribute the load over the days, over the weeks? And that's the chapter 3, where I start talking about progression, where I really start getting into periodization models. Like, all right, here's how you need to distribute the stress. Because at this stage, we're only going to see a small boost in performance or a small boost in size that's barely going to be able to be tracked. And if we just go hard or go home, that's not going to be sufficient at this stage of the game for you to make good progress. And yeah, so I think that's a really savvy thing to have picked up on. So kudos to you, sir.
Hey man, kudos to you for writing those, and also for those Blackboard videos way back in the day with Matt Odus and all those. Man, those were game changers for a lot of people, including me.
If you don't love the portrait mode S3 recordings in a dark room with me writing on a whiteboard and you can barely see it, then you just don't love science. That's not
we're old school, man. We're old school here. So in regards to progression models, one that got really popular with Mike Israel is just adding sets, which I know you have a lot of discussions between you and them, both papers published and all of that. But, and I also think he changed a little bit his mind in regards to just adding sets, just because it's not that simple, and it's not also our first choice. Just, okay, week after week, more sets towards our maximum recoverable volume. Because by definition, maximum recoverable volume, it's not maximum adaptive volume. What we want to do, it's to adapt, not to recover. Why do I want to recover just from training? I'm going to stay the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I think I have it here. It was the Volume 4, Issue 7 of the Mass Research Review. You actually proposed a progression framework for hypertrophy. Can we talk a little bit about that one, please?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to give a shout out to Mike Israel, because there was a time point where MRV and MAV in his models, I want to say circa 2014, were the same. So it was there was not MAV, and I don't want to take credit for this at all, because I think it included conversations with some other folks in our field. But he has said to me that I was part of the influence of that. The understanding of the difference between MAV and MRV that got added to that model was something that came out of some of those conversations. So, to Mike's credit, I think his models do change over time to better reflect, his understanding in the data. So yeah, so our that was our first epic battle of me going like, hold on, MRV is the point where you're on the other side of the curve, where you're doing as much as you can, but you're not progressing. Like, maybe for an overload cycle, but why would you have that be the goal most of the time? And he was like, oh, that's a really good point. And it was Greg who also was in that. It was actually Jeff Nippard back in the day when he was hosting the roundtables.
Yeah, sure. He was also with Lane Norton. I think he was there.
Yep. So that was an epic one. I think it was Jeff hosting me, Lane, Greg, and Mike. I don't think anybody else on that one. But again, that was 7 years ago. And from there, yeah, Mike revised the model. He's like, okay, well, we need to think about it. MRV is for overreaching, and that's past the point. Like, it's more than what you would give you the most outcome, and you probably don't want to spend there. That's where if you hit that, you need to go back. And I think that was a huge improvement on the model. I think the more recent debates we've had is, and I don't think he intended this, but the review paper he wrote, or the opinion-based piece he wrote in the Strength Conditioning Journal, made it seem like, at least when I read it, that the only logical and optimal way to do progression in a hypertrophy program was to add sets, because sets are the thing that we see the relationship with. It's not about adding load. Therefore, if you're not adding sets, you're doing it wrong. And I don't think that was his intention, but I think I read it that way, and I knew a lot of other people would. So myself, Brian Miner, and Jacob Skepis said, we need to let's engage with this. Let's write a letter to the editor, and let's talk about some of the problems with that. And the main problem with that, I think, is that the idea that you need to manipulate number of sets on the week-to-week time scale. And I think that is might make sense for certain people at a certain stage of their career. It doesn't always make sense in all cases. And there is a potential cost of adding more changes to a model and reducing your diagnostic clarity of seeing, is this current sufficient amount of volume working? And it comes down philosophically as to, do you want to bet on the potential of getting better gains, but also potentially muddying the waters and not being able to see it as you're ramping up fatigue? Or do you want to maybe lose out on that theoretical possible benefit, but keep things a little more static so that you can actually see if there's a change before then deciding to make an adjustment? And for the reasons I stated, earlier in our conversation, I think it makes more sense to lean upon the little more clear, a little more static side for higher level individuals, where any progress is something that you need to be able to identify. And since the progress is small, a small amount of fatigue can mask it. So what does that mean? The model that we suggested was essentially increasing sets at time points where you have established that you are not making progress, and you have also established that that's not due to fatigue, right? And that's kind of like there's a flow chart in my book that I had long before we ever got into this debate. It's like, are you plateaued? If the answer is no, then don't do anything, right? And I think a lot of people are like, I want to make faster progress. And I'm like, well, we all do, but that's going to eventually just get you into overtraining, that mindset. So
just a little point there, the metrics for being plateaued are, as I have it here, strength increases, rep increases, and that's when volume load increases in general. That's when we take decisions, right? Those are the metrics for progression. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. So now we're going to come full circle, folks, and we're going to, we took a big old dump on volume load, and now we're gonna clean that poo off, and we're going to say, volume load. Yes, we're lifting you back into the limelight, because the beauty of tracking your own volume load is it's very sensitive because it has 3 factors in it, right? So if you add one more rep to a 3x10, if you go 3x11, volume load goes up a little bit. If you can add 2.5 kilos to your 3x10, volume load goes up a little bit. Of course, if you go 4x10, it'll go up automatically. But here's the difference. You can't always add a rep. You can't always add load. If you're not strong enough, you can't do another rep. If you're not strong enough, you can't add another 2.5 kilos and maintain 3x10. But if you've got time and the gym is still open, you could rack the bar and do another set. So the beauty of load and reps is that they are performance capped, which means they can be used as biofeedback. Sets is something that is, I would argue, is a true intentional increase in volume. But load and rep increases, those are indications that you have progressed. So what I proposed in that mass article was that, hey, we can actually take volume load back on the table, and we can say, hey, if your volume load is increasing when you're not changing the number of sets, that's a good sign. That means that you're actively progressing. That could, now there's some ambiguity there for hypertrophy. Is that because I'm getting better muscular endurance? Is that because I'm getting some neurological adaptations that allow me to be stronger? Perhaps, but eventually those will fall off. And if there's no, and we can't assume that there's no cross-sectional area contribution. And the reality is, unless you've got a DEXA in your home or an ultrasound, it's the best we've got. So performance is...
We all have a DEXA scan, right? I have it.
I mean,
I have mine right there.
It's right there. Yeah, exactly.
You can see it, but I can assure you it's there.
If I could just move my phone, I don't know how. Yeah. So unless you have some way of measuring gram changes in muscle mass without any error, performance is the best we got. So therefore, you can use load and rep increases, which would result in the change in volume load, as a diagnostic criteria as to whether or not I am progressing. And that's your objective way to know, am I plateaued? Then from there, you can assess, okay, I am plateaued. What is the cause of that plateau? And you can look at things like, well, what's my sleep quality? Am I sore? What's my motivation to train? Do I generally feel beat up? And do I have the time and energy to dedicate to more training? And if the answer is, I'm not beat up, my sleep's fine, I'm motivated to train, I would like to train more, and I have the time to do it, the answer is your plateau is probably because you're not doing enough. And this needs to also be thought about over what's a reasonable time scale. Like if I only waited a week to see increases in load or reps, I would always think I'm plateaued, just because I don't make progress at that rate anymore. But if in my first year of training, if I went 2 weeks and I didn't see a rep or load increase, that would have been different to what I could expect as a novice, right?
Sure, sure.
So if you have the appropriate time scale, which is subjective in nature and individualized, you can look at rep and load increases as a diagnostic criteria. And if you are recovered, but you are plateaued and you haven't made progress, that's when you go, you know what, I need to find a way to increase volume. So it's kind of this feed forward, feed backward mechanism, rather than a this no matter what increase in sets per week. I think another thing that happened from that conversation, which I'd like to clarify, is people got the impression that in all cases I'm against increasing sets week to week to week, and that's not actually the case. I regularly use mesocycles where that's the variable I progress purposefully. So for example, if I have a powerlifter and we're, let's say, 12 weeks out from competition, the increases that I might do in that 12, 11, 10 week mesocycle as we're getting closer to the competition might be increasing the number of sets each week or every other week, while I also bump up the proximity to failure, because I'm focusing on, look, you know, your estimated 1RM while we're training in a high rep range and primarily with accessories. I don't really care that much. I'm trying to do things that hopefully lay the foundation for what we're doing later. So I'm increasing sets there. But as we get closer to the competition, I might actually be decreasing sets as I also increase the load and decrease the rep range and taper them for competition. So it's very context dependent. I think people just need to get away from the idea that the default evidence-based hypertrophy model that everyone should use is a weekly increase in sets, because I don't think that necessarily matches a variety of training ages. And I don't think it's necessary, and it can add more ambiguity as far as whether or not you're making progress or just experiencing changes in fatigue.
Can also shorten the length of a mesocycle. If you go from 10 to 20 right away, well, maybe you have just 4 weeks of training. But if you're a little bit more patient in regards to volume load, as in reps, as in load, you can lengthen that mesocycle at 8 weeks, perhaps, get more proficient training.
I 100% agree. And I think a lot of this all comes down to application. So, for example, if you increase a set on every exercise you do week to week, that can be a huge increase. Like, let's say you start with 3 sets per exercise and you go to 4. That's a 33% increase in volume and time spent in the gym for every muscle group, because you're doing it on every exercise. However, if you are going, you know, I'm going to increase the number of sets per muscle group by 1, and only 1 muscle group, like call it a delt specialization cycle, then across the whole week, you've added 1 set of lateral raises, 1 set of rear delts, 1 set of overhead presses, and maybe 1 set of another exercise. That's only 4 additional sets per week. So that is very different. It's also different if, let's say, like you said, you start at 10 sets per muscle group and you go to 20, versus stay starting at 8 and you go to 12. You know, going from 10 to 20 over 6 weeks, that's like 2 sets per week added. It's a 20% increase in volume from baseline. So I think there are ways to do it that make a whole lot more sense, in my opinion. And to Dr. Isichel's credit, most of the time he discusses starting from what is an estimated minimal effective dose and then progressing relatively slowly. I think that's another motivation I had to write that letter to the editor, is the example figure, which was just an example, but I didn't want people to take it literally, was going from 10 to 20 sets in a single mesocycle. And I was like, whoa, that's like doubling your volume, bro. Like, that's, we need to consider that. So yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to application rather than the whole idea of adding sets being problematic, which I don't think it is. I think you just need to think, is that per muscle group? Is it per movement? Is it all the muscle groups at the same time? Is it a specialization cycle, et cetera, et cetera?
And like you mentioned, one almost final point, doubling your volume is not equal to doubling your hypertrophy, doubling your gains. Maybe it's just
Absolutely
doubling your total work.
It definitely is doubling your total work. It's probably not quite doubling your.
A little bit, yeah, but there you go. All cool.
Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, it definitely is doubling your total work if you double your number of sets, and it's might be closer to doubling your fatigue, but probably not quite, as you are getting actually better at adapting to doing more work. But what we know for sure is it's certainly not doubling your hypertrophy. And with that kind of a change, it almost certainly is going from decent, making progress, to making the same amount or even less progress and being plateaued. Because there is some other curve on the other side of that U eventually, where you are just burning the candle at both ends.
Very well. So I think it's been a really comprehensive chat. We covered quite a bit of topics from the ground up, and we ended up pretty much in the same spot, which is volume load. So then again, sorry, volume load. We do love you. We don't mean any wrong to you.
You have been redeemed. That's right.
So anyway, any final key takeaways that you would like to tell to the people? Maybe we can mm, keep it simple.
Yeah, I would say just remember that the key variables for hypertrophy are first effort, proximity to failure, making sure that your sets are appropriate. That doesn't necessarily mean failure. In fact, I don't even think the people are ready for the data coming out right now. Like some of the preliminary stuff I've seen where like groups training at like a 4 to 6 RP are getting the same as a group training at 7 to 9
Yeah.
outcomes. And knowing that people probably are underestimating their RP a little bit. So it's probably more like a 3 to 5 RPE
Right,
compared
right.
to a group, trained to failure. I think that'll just conflict with the machismo in the bodybuilding community, but it needs to be still reasonably close to failure. And so it's effort and then volume. And then how much volume? Remember, that's individual. So I would say don't use the meta-analyses and the publications, even in my book, for volume guidelines as biblical commandments. Use them as a decent starting point if you don't have good data knowing what's best for you. But if you do have good data knowing what's best for you, that is what you should focus on primarily.
Very well. So I think that covers it all. I want to thanks again for your time. It's like the last time, a huge honor, a huge pleasure, and I learned a lot with these conversations. And I hope we can meet one day, hopefully.
My pleasure, man. Thank you for having me on. Always asking such great questions.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, man. You're going to make me blush.
Yeah, Pat.
But anyway, have a great day, have good training, and I hope everything gets better right there in New Zealand. So we
Back
can,
at you, brother.
very
Thank you
well.
so much.
Thanks to you,
Take care,
Mr. Helm.
Daniel. All right, man.
See you later.
Bye-bye.